The air thickened with the enemy's triumphant shouts, drowning out their desperate cries for aid. Ahead, hidden by the dense green curtain of the jungle, two massive trees loomed, positioned with elaborate, uncanny precision. They stood like executioners, ready to fall at any moment. A death trap lay in wait for the flimsy boats struggling upriver, laden with the last hope for a starving settlement. One wrong move, one splintered oar, and it was over. This is Forgotten Horizons, and you are listening to Before the Cannibals, Hans Staden's Baptism by Fire and Famine. Before he was the cannibals' captive, before his name became legend, whispered in tales of unimaginable horror and improbable survival, Hans Staden was a young German musketeer, his heart ablaze with the fire of adventure. He sought not gold, but the raw, untamed experiences of a world then flinging open its hidden doors. But the new world, in its terrifying beauty and brutal indifference, demanded a steep price for its revelations. It offered no gentle initiation. Instead, it plunged him headlong into a crucible of desperate sieges, the haunting companionship of starvation, and a battle for existence that would carve itself into his very soul. This is the untold story of his first voyage, a relentless odyssey of fire and famine, the forging of a survivor against odds that would break most men. This is the story of Hans Staden's baptism, not by water, but by the inferno of the untamed 16th century Americas. The mid-16th century. A tremor of excitement, of boundless possibility, ran through the cobbled streets of Europe. Tales of new continents, of oceans conquered and empires found, were the currency of the day. In Homburg, nestled in the German region of Hessen, a young man named Hans Staden felt this irresistible pull. He yearned, as he later wrote, to see the wide world, to witness for himself the marvels of the distant lands then collectively, and somewhat vaguely, known as the Indies. His journey began not with royal fanfare, but with the humble determination of a man set on a course. From Bremen through Gotland to the bustling Hanseatic port of Kampen in Holland, he found passage on a ship laden with cargo, its destination, Portugal, the gateway to the vast unknown. On April the 29th, 1547, after 4 weeks at sea, he stepped ashore in Setúbal, a salt-trading town. Lisbon, the vibrant maritime heart of a burgeoning empire, was but 5 miles distant, and to Lisbon he went. There, amidst the clamor of shipwrights and the exotic scent of spices, he found lodging with a fellow German, an innkeeper named Loer the Younger. To his host, Staden eagerly confessed his ambition, to sail to the Americas. But timing, it seemed, was not on his side. The king's ships, those grand vessels sailing under royal commission to the Indies, had already departed. A period of waiting ensued, Staden serving his host, his impatience undoubtedly a restless companion. But Loer proved resourceful. He eventually secured the young German a position that would thrust him directly into the maw of adventure. Staden was to be a Büchsenschütze, a gunner, aboard a ship commanded by one Captain Fernand Pintado. The vessel was bound for the coast of Brazil, a land then beginning its transformation into a remote repository for Portugal's exiles, a desterro. Pintado's mission, however, was far more complex and infinitely more dangerous than merely ferrying convicts. He carried a royal license, a sanction that blurred the lines between naval duty and outright piracy, His orders permitted him to engage in caporet, privateering, against any North African ships encountered along the Barbary coast. Furthermore, once in Brazilian waters, he was authorized to confront and seize any French vessels found trading there, an activity Lisbon considered an illicit infringement upon its claimed territories. His ship, accompanied by a smaller consort, was, in Staden's own observant words, formidably well-rigged with all war gear one uses at sea. It was a floating arsenal primed for conflict. Aboard this Portuguese vessel, amidst a predominantly Lusitanian crew, were 3 Germans, Hans von Bruckhausen, Heinrich Brandt from Bremen, and Hans Staden, his new role as gunner placing him at the epicenter of any hostilities their aggressive commission might ignite. Their initial passage carried them south to the Portuguese island of Madeira, its capital Funchal, a verdant jewel in the Atlantic. Even then, Staden noted, the island was renowned for its fertility, rich with wine and sugar. Here they reprovisioned. But Captain Pintado, perhaps emboldened by his well-armed ship and the latitude of his orders, harbored ambitions beyond a simple Atlantic crossing. The Christian world was locked in a protracted, simmering conflict with the powers of the Halbmond, the Ottoman Crescent, and any strike against North African territory was seen not just as strategic, but as a righteous blow for Christendom. Pintado resolved on a martial detour. He steered his ships towards the African coast, to a port town Staden recorded as Cap de Gel, likely Cap Gear, a place that had once flown the Portuguese flag, but had since fallen into the hands of the North Africans, ruled by a leader Staden refers to as König Schireffe. Near this hostile shore, they encountered Spanish fishermen who provided vital intelligence. There were indeed ships in the harbor. Patience was soon rewarded. A vessel, its sails catching the African breeze, was observed emerging from the port, evidently laden with valuable merchandise. The Portuguese ships gave chase. The pursuit was swift, the capture decisive. The North African crew, desperate to escape servitude or death, abandoned their ship and fled in small boats towards the land. But the Portuguese, the Lusitanians, were relentless. A party of them, in a display of remarkable audacity, even landed on the hostile shore, braving the North African cavalry that galloped along the beach, swords flashing in the sun. After a spirited and courageous skirmish, they seized the beached longboat belonging to the fugitive North Africans, taking it as a tangible trophy. They had, as the saying went, truly broken a lance in Africa. Triumphant, Pintado's expedition returned to Madeira, their prize ship's hold brimming with a rich and exotic cargo. Sugar, valuable hides, almonds, dates, supple goatskins, and precious gum Arabic. From Madeira, Pintado dispatched the smaller accompanying vessel back to Lisbon, carrying a report of their successful engagement. In due course, orders arrived from the Crown. He was to leave the prize and its cargo at Madeira for the king's deliberation and continue his voyage to Brazil. The taste of victory on the African coast, however, had ignited a bolder fire in Captain Pintado. Instead of sailing directly for the Americas, he decided to hazard another strike against the same Berber port, Cape de Gel. But this time, fortune withheld her favor. Contrary winds, stubborn and unyielding, frustrated their approach. Then, as was common in the late autumn seas around Madeira, a ferocious storm wind descended upon them. On the turbulent night before All Saints' Day, the ocean unleashed its fury. The tempestuous gale forced them to abandon their aggressive designs on Africa. Turning their prows towards the vast, dark expanse of the Atlantic, their course was now, finally, set for Brazil. As they sailed into the tropics, the ocean transformed. Staden, ever the keen observer, meticulously noted the wonders of the deep. He described the teeming schools of bonitos and dorades that swarmed around their vessel, their sleek bodies flashing like silver and gold in the sunlit waters. He marveled especially at the flying fish, which he called by their Latin name peixe volador, or as the Portuguese sailors termed them, peixes voadores. These creatures, the size of herring with fins like bat wings, would erupt from the waves in glittering shoals when pursued by larger predators, launching themselves into the air, soaring for astonishing distances, sometimes almost out of sight, before plunging back into the embrace of the sea. Often, Staden noted, they would find some of these aerial mariners lying on the deck in the morning, having misjudged their nocturnal flights and landed aboard the ship. But the voyage was not all wonder. They reached the vicinity of the equinoctial line, where the heat became an oppressive entity, the sun blazing directly overhead at midday. There were periods of dead calm, the ship motionless under a burning sky, the air thick and still, the sails hanging limp. These suffocating calms were often broken by violent thunderstorms that erupted with little warning, especially at night, unleashing torrential rain and furious gusts of wind that demanded constant vigilance from the crew. And then came the true test, a persistent, strong contrary wind, the relentless southeast trade wind blowing directly against their intended course to Brazil. Progress slowed to a crawl. Days bled into weeks, and as their supplies dwindled under the strain of the protracted voyage, a new and chilling fear began to creep into the hearts of the crew, the spectre of starvation. Their provisions, calculated for a more direct passage, were shrinking at an alarming rate. In their distress, the crew turned to prayer, imploring God for a favorable wind. It was during this period of growing desperation that Staden witnessed a phenomenon that etched itself deeply into his memory. And it happened one night, he recounts, that we had a great storm, were in great trouble. Then many blue lights appeared to us in the ship, of which I had never seen more. When the waves crashed over the bow of our ship, the lights also went there. These ethereal, flickering blue flames danced upon the masts and rigging. The Portuguese sailors, more accustomed to the ocean's strange moods, recognized them. The Portuguese said, Staden continued, that the lights were a sign of good future weather, especially sent by God in our distress to comfort us. We gave thanks to God for it with a common prayer. Thereafter they disappeared again, and these lights are called Sant Elmo. This manifestation of Saint Elmo's fire, interpreted as a divine sign, a promise of deliverance, deeply impressed the young gunner. When day broke, the ferocity of the wind had indeed subsided, and it shifted to a favorable direction, reinforcing their belief that the lights had truly been a wonderwork of God, a heavenly miracle in their hour of need. At long last, propelled by this favorable wind, after a grueling 84 days at sea since their departure from the African coast on January 28th, the lookout's cry pierced the monotony. Land ho! They had sighted Cape Augustine. A few hours sailing north from the Cape, they entered the harbor of what Staden recorded as Bramtenbuke, Pernambuco, situated at approximately 8 degrees south latitude. Pintado's ship, a small but potent instrument of war, had arrived in what one chronicler later described as a blessed hour. For the Portuguese settlements in this region of Brazil were in a perilous state. Unbeknownst to Staden, his arrival coincided with a crisis that would demand all his nascent skills as a soldier. Just north of the main harbor of Pernambuco, the Portuguese colonists were clinging precariously to their new world. The commander of the territory, a man Staden names as Artosoelio or Artocosli, a version of Duarte Coelho, the governor, was facing a massive rebellion. The indigenous tribes, the Wilden as Staden termed them, who had previously been at peace, had risen against the Portuguese, their warriors, numbering in the thousands, now laying siege to Coelho's fledgling plantations and forts. One small settlement, which Staden calls Beitrit, was already under pressure. Even more desperate was the situation of Iguaraçu, a settlement Staden refers to as Iguarassu, located a few hours' journey north of Pernambuco on the banks of a small river. This outpost was tightly besieged, its defenders isolated and staring into a future that looked increasingly grim. Coelho, having established Iguaraçu on the mainland and another settlement on the nearby island of Itamaracá, along with Marine further south, now saw his colonial enterprise on the verge of collapse. Having disembarked the exiles he had transported from Portugal and unloaded some of his goods, Captain Pintado was preparing to continue his voyage. However, he was approached by Duarte Coelho himself. The Hauptmann de Land, the captain of the land, implored him, for God's sake, to lend his aid to the desperate settlers in Iguaraçu. The outpost was so fiercely besieged that no relief could be sent from Marin, as Olinda itself was braced for an imminent attack. Pintado, a man clearly not averse to conflict, agreed. Staden himself tells of their departure on this critical mission. "We came," he recounts, "to help those of Iguarassu with 40 men from our ship, sailing there in a small boat. This small contingent, including the young German gunner, set off towards the beleaguered settlement. The little place," Staden observed, "lay on an arm of the sea which extends 2 miles inland. Upon reaching Iguaraçu, the grim reality of the siege became starkly apparent. Staden estimated their own numbers. There might have been no more than 90 of us Christians, besides 30 loyal and Christianized slaves, who belonged to the inhabitants. These slaves were likely Africans and assimilated Brazilians. Against this meager force, he reported, the wild people who besieged us were estimated at 8,000. The defenders' only protection was a rudimentary palisade, what Staden dismissed as a fence of stakes, or a rampart of reeds, encircling their small enclave. The area surrounding Iguaraçu was enveloped by dense forest and wilderness. Within this concealing wilderness, the besiegers had constructed formidable fortifications from the trunks of large trees. These served as strongholds into which they could retreat if the defenders attempted a sortie, and where they sheltered during the night. For their daytime assaults, they had dug a network of earth holes, pits, or trenches around the settlement, from which they launched skirmishing attacks and took cover from retaliatory fire. Staden noted their tactics with a gunner's eye. When the Portuguese muskets fired, the warriors would instantly drop to the ground, believing this would allow the bullets to pass harmlessly overhead. Their most feared weapons were burning arrows. These projectiles, tipped with cotton or tree wool impregnated with wax, were set ablaze before being launched in high, terrifying arcs. They rained down upon the settlement, their purpose to ignite the highly flammable thatched roofs of the houses, or to burn any unfortunate individuals caught in the open. The air was likely filled with the terrifying war cries of the besiegers, the sharp crack of Portuguese muskets, the whoosh and thud of arrows, and the roar of flames when the incendiaries found their mark. Adding a psychological dimension to their assault, the natives would engage in vivid pantomimes from beyond the palisades, graphically demonstrating how they intended to devour the Europeans once they were captured, a chilling promise of cannibalistic fury that preyed on the deepest fears of the besieged. The most pressing and debilitating crisis within the encircled Iguaraçu, however, was the severe lack of provisions. We still had a little to eat, Staden recorded grimly, and that soon ran out. In normal times, the settlers relied on daily foraging expeditions into the surrounding forest and forays to their nearby plantations to gather fresh edible roots and the manioc meal necessary for making cakes and bread. The concept of laying in substantial stores for a prolonged siege had never been a priority. Now, with all access to the outside cut off by the thousands of hostile warriors, hunger began to gnaw at the defenders. Starvation loomed as a threat perhaps even more immediate than the enemy at their gates. "We suffered greatly from this lack of provisions," Staden wrote, their hope resting only on divine intervention or a desperate gamble. Some outlet, some means of acquiring food, had to be found. The most feasible, though still incredibly dangerous option lay to the north, on the small island of Itamaracá, where another Portuguese settlement, hopefully better supplied, was located. A bold, almost suicidal venture to fetch provisions from Itamaracá by water was deemed the only chance to save Iguaraçu. 2 barks, small, sturdy boats, were manned for the perilous expedition. Hans Staden, with his crucial skills as a gunner, was among them. The native warriors, anticipating such an attempt, had taken elaborate measures to prevent any relief from reaching the starving outpost by its riverine access. They had thoroughly barricaded the narrow waterway leading from Iguaraçu, with a formidable combination of felled tree trunks, dragged and jammed across the channel. Actual traps, as one account describes them based on Staden's report, were also set, likely snares and deadfalls, constructed using long, strong lianas or tipos, which the natives kept ready to pull taut, intending to crush or capsize any small boats that dared to attempt passage. And all along both banks of the river, in the dense concealing foliage, lurked the warriors, an estimated 8,000 of them, ready to unleash a deadly ambush. The very rhythm of the tides, the ebb and flow of the water, further complicated any such expedition, making navigation treacherous and exposing any craft to the enemy's view for extended periods. Yet driven by the desperation of impending starvation and the indomitable will to survive, the audacious Lusitanians, with Staden providing vital firepower, resolved to make the attempt. They set out for Itamaracá. The tension must have been almost unbearable. One can imagine the small barks, hugging the riverbanks under cover of darkness or in the uncertain light of dawn, the men's hearts pounding with every rustle in the undergrowth. every suspicious shadow. The creak of oars, the lapping of water against the hulls, would have sounded deafening in the charged silence. With sheer force, they managed to break through the initial blockades of fallen timber. But their struggles were compounded when the tide receded, leaving their vessels temporarily grounded on the muddy riverbed, exposed and vulnerable. The natives, seeing the defenders' predicament, but unable to directly assault them in their boats, devised a cunning plan. They gathered a large quantity of dry wood from their fortifications and began hurling it into the space between the riverbank and the stranded barks. Their intention was to set this massive woodpile ablaze and then to throw into the flames the potent local pepper, which grew abundantly in the region. The acrid, choking smoke, they hoped, would drive the Europeans from the cover of their ships and into their Waitan hands. The air must have filled with the scent of potential burning, the sharp aroma of pepper, and the palpable tension of this standoff. Fortunately for Staden and his companions, this fiery, suffocating strategy did not succeed. Before the natives could fully implement their plan, the tide began to turn, and the rising water refloated the barks. They managed to break free and continue their journey, eventually reaching Itamaracá, where the inhabitants, understanding their dire need, provided them with the desperately needed victuals. With their boats now laden with life-saving supplies, they began the hazardous return voyage to Iguaraçu. They found that the natives had not been idle. The river passage was once again heavily barricaded with felled trees, just as before. Warriors lay in wait along the banks. This time, however, the natives had prepared an even more elaborate and dangerous trap. As Staden's group approached, they saw that two large trees, standing near the river's edge, had been sawn almost completely through their trunks at the base, left precariously balanced. To the tops of these compromised trees, the natives had securely fastened long, strong lianas, the tough, pliable jungle vines the locals called sipo, which Staden described as being much thicker than hop vines. The other ends of these sipo lianas were held by warriors concealed in their entrenchments along the riverbank. The natives' intention was clear and utterly terrifying. As the Portuguese barks approached and attempted to force a passage through the logjam, the warriors would pull hard and simultaneously on the sipo. This would cause the weakened trees to snap at their bases and topple directly onto the vessels, crushing them, their crews, and their precious cargo of food. It was a deadly snare, designed to turn the very forest into a weapon against them. Before Staden's group began their attempt to break this new, more menacing blockade, they began to call out loudly, shouting towards Iguaraçu in the hopes that their comrades besieged within the town would hear them and perhaps sally out to create a diversion or offer supporting fire. However, as soon as their calls for aid rang out, the native warriors on the banks began their own chorus of shouts, war cries, and jeers, a cacophony so loud that it completely drowned out the Portuguese voices, preventing any message from reaching the anxious ears in Iguaraçu. Furthermore, a dense thicket of woods stood between the river and the settlement, obscuring any visual contact. Though they were physically close enough to be heard under normal circumstances, the natives' strategic noise and the intervening forest rendered communication impossible. The air was thick with the sounds of this desperate struggle, the straining of men, the creaking of timber as boats scraped past submerged logs, the defiant shouts of the attackers, and the desperate, unheard calls of the relief force. There was no turning back. With grim determination, they pressed on, maneuvering their barks towards the prepared trap. With a surge of collective effort, they smashed through the initial layers of felled logs. The tension was immense. As they passed beneath the prepared trees, the natives pulled. The first of the booby-trapped trees, when triggered, thankfully fell away from them, crashing harmlessly towards the natives' own positions on the bank. But the second tree, a massive trunk, came perilously close. With a thunderous crack and a mighty splash, it thundered into the water just astern of their small ship, missing them by what must have felt like inches. A collective gasp of relief, quickly suppressed. They had narrowly escaped a potentially fatal ambush. Having navigated these treacherous obstacles and broken the blockade for a second time, they finally brought the life-saving victuals into the starving town of Iguaraçu. The arrival of food was nothing short of miraculous, breathing new life and hope into the beleaguered defenders. This successful resupply proved to be the decisive turning point of the siege. When the native tribes witnessed this incredible feat, when they saw that even their overwhelming numbers and elaborate blockade could not break the immense energy of the few Europeans, their resolve began to crumble. After nearly a month of relentless pressure, during which many of their own warriors had fallen to the defenders' firearms, the native leaders concluded that further conflict was futile. They made overtures for peace, and the siege of Iguaraçu was finally lifted. While several of the native warriors had perished during the protracted conflict, Staden reported that, remarkably, not a single Christian life was lost. With peace restored, Captain Pintado's brave contingent, Hans Staden among them, made their way back to Marin and then to Pernambuco, where their larger ship had been waiting. They replenished their supplies of water and essential manioc flour. Duarte Coelho, whose captaincy had been pulled back from the brink of annihilation, expressed his profound gratitude to Pintado and his men for their timely and courageous intervention. This episode, small in the grand scale of colonial history, was nonetheless critical. Had the native rebellion succeeded in wiping out Coelho's settlements, the progress of European colonization in that part of Brazil might have been set back by many years. His duty at Iguaraçu discharged, Captain Pintado resumed his original voyage. To procure a cargo of valuable Brazil wood, the dyewood that gave the land its name, he sailed his ship, according to Staden, some 40 miles from thence to a little port, Portuguese named, where he also anticipated obtaining fresh victuals from the local native population, perhaps by trade, perhaps by force. Fate, however, had another encounter in store for them. At Portuguese, they came upon a heavily armed French ship, also engaged in loading Brazil wood. This the Portuguese considered an illegal intrusion, as the Brazil trade was, by royal decree, a Portuguese monopoly. Pintado, ever ready for a confrontation and acting within the scope of his aggressive commission, immediately ordered an attack on the French vessel. A fierce engagement ensued, but this time, the fortunes of war turned decisively against the Portuguese. A well-aimed and powerful cannon shot, a minenschuss, as one account records it, indicating a shot of devastating impact, from the French ship struck Pintado's vessel, critically damaging its main mast and severely damaging its sails. The Portuguese suffered casualties, with several men killed and others wounded. The French ship, having inflicted significant damage, managed to break off the engagement and make its escape. The precise location of this Portuguese remains uncertain, but the sting of this defeat was palpable. After this disastrous encounter, Captain Pintado, his ship damaged and his crew disheartened, made the decision to abandon his trading and privateering activities in Brazilian waters and set sail for the long voyage back to Portugal. The return journey to Portugal, Hans Staden somberly noted, was to be a most sorrowful one. From the very outset, they were plagued by ill fortune. Contrary winds buffeted the ship relentlessly, making it exceedingly difficult to even clear the Brazilian coast. Once they gained the open sea, they were assailed by a relentless series of storms, the sky often a bruised purple, the waves mountains of churning water. But the greatest torment, transcending even the fury of the elements, was the ever-worsening lack of provisions. Hunger became their constant, unwelcome companion. The scarcity became so dire that, as Staden grimly recalled, some among the crew resorted to eating boxhäute, goat hides, that were on board, likely tough, unpalatable skins that were part of the cargo or ship's stores, boiled to a semblance of edibility. Their daily ration was reduced to a pitiful magline, or nöselen, a small measure, perhaps a nutshell full, of water per day, and a tiny portion of coarse Brazilian root flour, likely Murzeln meal or manioc. For 108 agonizing days, they endured this torment at sea. The gnawing emptiness in their stomachs, the foul taste of boiled animal skins, the parched throats from the meager water ration, the chilling touch of sea spray, and the debilitating weakness that spread through their emaciated bodies must have created an atmosphere of profound despair. Each sunrise was a question, each sunset a minor miracle of endurance. Then, on August 12th, after those 108 endless days adrift, the sorely tested crew reached the island of Flores, one of the Azores, Portuguese islands that served as vital way stations in the Atlantic. Here, in an unexpected turn of events, they encountered another ship at sea. At the sight of this new vessel, despite their weakened state and the pervasive hunger that gripped them, the old martial spirit of the Lusitanians, and perhaps the desperation of men pushed to their limits, flared anew. They approached to ascertain its identity. It turned out to be a pirate ship. The pirates attempted to defend themselves, but Staden's crew, perhaps hardened by their recent privations or still possessing superior armament, gained the upper hand and succeeded in capturing the vessel. The pirate crew, however, managed to escape to the shore in their small boats, abandoning their ship to the Portuguese. For Staden and his shipmates, this capture was a deliverance that bordered on the miraculous. On board the prize, one account records with evident relief, was much bread and wine, to the great refreshment of the captors. The sudden abundance of wholesome food and drink after months of near starvation must have seemed a direct intervention of Providence, a tangible blessing that revived their spirits and began to mend their ravaged bodies. The taste of simple bread, the invigoration of wine after so long an endurance of near famine, must have been an almost overwhelming relief. At the Azores, their fortunes continued to improve. They fell in with 5 Portuguese warships, which were stationed there to provide protection for the valuable merchant fleets returning from India, guarding them against the depredations of African pirates who roamed these waters. Pintado's ship, now somewhat restored and its crew regaining strength, was even able to lend assistance to one of these merchantmen, an India ship, as it sought to anchor at the island of Terceira. A considerable fleet, numbering around 100 ships, had gathered at Terceira, hailing from various territories of the New World, some bound for Spain, others, like Staden's, for Portugal. This powerful convoy, offering mutual protection, set sail from the Azores for the final leg of their journey. Escorted by the 5 Portuguese warships and Captain Pintado's own vessel, this stately squadron of 100 ships, presenting what must have been a truly magnificent sight on the high sea, made its way towards the Portuguese mainland. Thus, on October 8th, in the year 1548, Hans Staden returned to Lisbon. His first voyage to the New World had lasted 16 arduous months. It had been a period of intense trial and extraordinary experience, a true baptism by fire and famine. He had departed as an eager young man seeking to witness the wonders of the world, and he returned a hardened survivor, his resilience forged in the crucible of siege, battle, ambush, and the haunting spectre of starvation. Through it all, he had indeed, as he had initially wished, experienced God's work and his wonders in the sea, though perhaps in ways far more terrifying and transformative than he could ever have imagined. He had faced death in many guises, from enemy arrows, from the threat of cannibalistic fury, from the crushing power of the forest, from the slow, agonizing grip of hunger on a storm-tossed sea. And each time, he had endured. After this arduous expedition, Hans Staden remained in Lisbon for a considerable time, recuperating and no doubt reflecting on the profound and brutal education the New World had offered him. His spirit of adventure, however, was not quenched, but perhaps tempered, given a new, steely edge. For it was during this period of rest that he resolved to embark on another venture to the Americas, this time with a Spanish expedition destined for the distant Rio de la Plata. The vast, unpredictable ocean and the wild, perilous coasts of the New World, it seemed, were not yet finished with Hans Staden. His greatest trials, the experiences that would etch his name into the annals of survival, still lay shrouded in the mists of the future, on shores even more forbidding than those he had just narrowly escaped. His journey into the heart of peril had only just begun. The drowning land awaited.